Hello and welcome to Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. When I was about 11 or 12, I was watching the news at my grandparents' house one weekend when I was having a sleepover. They always watched the 10 o'clock news, and sometimes they would let us stay up past our bedtime and watch it with them. As we watched the news, the anchorman, Dick Norse, the news anchor in Salt Lake City that I grew up watching, began to talk about people who had been murdered in a record and electronics store in Ogden. My little town didn't have a record store or a stereo store, but I had been to them in Salt Lake City and they were my favorite places on earth. I think that's part of why I remember this event so well. I remember it because it took place in a record store. I remember hearing something about people's insides being eaten out by Drano. And I asked my grandpa, "What's Drano?" My grandparents immediately turned the TV volume down and I was quickly hustled off to bed. But I never forgot about what I saw on the news or the story about the terrible things that happened that night. This is the story of the Ogden Hi-Fi Shop murders. Let's get into it. April 1974. 16-year-old Courtney Nesbitt walked down the street near the record store where his friend, 20-year-old Stanley Walker, worked. Courtney had been running some errands and had asked his friend at the record shop if he could park his car in their parking lot. When Courtney finished with his errands, he wanted to go in the shop and say thank you to Stanley for letting him use the parking lot and say goodnight to him. Courtney opened the front door to the Ogden Hi-Fi Shop and walked inside, and he knew immediately that something was very wrong. His friend Stanley was standing very still in the shop, along with 19-year-old Sherry Michelle Ansley, another clerk at the store who had been hired just a week before. There were two men Courtney didn't recognize there as well, and they were startled by Courtney's appearance in the shop. He had stumbled onto a robbery in progress. His mind flashed back a few moments before he came in the shop, and he remembered a man standing outside near a running car, and he realized there's three of them. The two men inside the store had guns, and suddenly the men were yelling at Stanley, Michelle, and Courtney to start moving. The two men forced the trio down the interior stairs and into the basement. The assailants ordered all three of their captives onto the ground, and one held them at gunpoint while the other began to tie their hands and feet. One of the men was short and the other one was tall. The gunmen were 19-year-old William Andrews and 21-year-old Dale Selby Pierre. The man outside, waiting by the getaway car, was 19-year-old Keith Roberts, and all three of the men were in the U.S. Air Force and were stationed at Hill Air Force Base just outside of Ogden. Dale Selby Pierre also went by Pierre Selby and Dale Selby, but today I am going to refer to him as Pierre. It was now past time for both Stanley and Michelle to be home from work, and Courtney was well overdue back from running a couple of errands. Remember, Courtney was only 16 years old, so his mother was not only worried, but she was somewhat irritated that he wasn't home on time. Stanley Walker's father, a man named Orrin Walker, was also at home wondering where his son was. These worried and loving parents did what most parents would do before the time of cell phones. They got in their cars and they drove downtown to the store to look for their children. This act of love and concern would turn out to be fatal for one of them and life-changing for the other. Carol Nesbitt parked her car and went to the back door at the Hi-Fi Shop, grabbed the handle, and flung the door open. Standing there was William Andrews. Carol looked straight down the barrel of his gun, but she was not deterred. Andrews snapped at her. "What are you doing here, man?" She snapped back, "I'm checking on my son. What is going on here?" Courtney heard Pierre bolt up the stairs and then heard shuffling. Andrews and Pierre grabbed Carol and forced her down the stairs. Courtney Nesbitt, who was tied up on the basement floor, heard his mother's voice and he said out loud, "God damn it." Andrews pressed his gun into her back as Pierre forced Carol to her knees and then to her stomach. He tied her hands and her feet. She could see her son lying on the floor next to her, and he could hear her voice, but they did not look at each other. Neither of them spoke a word to each other. They simply laid there in silence. Stanley Walker's father, 43-year-old Orrin Walker, arrived at the store looking for his son. He met the same fate as Carol. He was accosted, forced to the basement, and tied up. What began as a robbery with two clerks in the store had quickly escalated, and the trio of robbers were now holding 5 people hostage in the basement of the hi-fi shop. The basement was barely lit. Only a single light bulb hung from the ceiling, but Courtney Nesbitt could hear what was happening and could even hear what was going on outside. As the men bound his mother, they froze when they heard a car door slam shut, but then turned back to their work as they heard the car wheels on the gravel behind the store pull away. With all 5 victims now securely bound on the floor, Pierre began to pace. He grabbed a stool from the corner and set a jug of liquid on it. He pulled out a green cup and poured some of the blue liquid from the jug into the cup. He walked over to Carol Nesbitt and said, "We're going to have a little cocktail party." Carol replied, "I don't drink," and Pierre said back to her, "You will drink this." He grabbed her by the hair and pulled her head back and pressed the cup against her teeth. Carol said, "What is it?" Andrews replied, "It's vodka and some kind of a German drug. It'll just put you to sleep." Courtney lay on the floor as he heard his mother take a large gulp of the liquid. Carol immediately began to cough and choke, spewing the liquid from her nose and mouth. The man lowered her back down to the carpet, and she lay there gasping for air and coughing. Pierre strutted across the room back to the jug filled with blue liquid. He was enjoying himself. Andrews then filled the cup again. Pierre stepped over Carol and grabbed Courtney's arms, turning him over and forcing him into a sitting position. The man grabbed Courtney's head and pressed the cup to his lips. The fumes from the cup burned Courtney's eyes and throat. This was not vodka. Pierre poured the liquid onto Courtney's lips, which immediately began to burn. Pierre then pried Courtney's mouth open and forced him to drink the liquid. It scalded his throat and belly, and he immediately vomited. He tried coughing the liquid up, but there were bubbles in his throat that formed each time he coughed. What happened next is too graphic for me to share the details of here, but the men then forced Stanley to drink the liquid as Carol and Courtney lay on the carpet, suffering the effects of what they were forced to ingest. The liquid was Drano, which is a caustic chemical product used for unclogging sink drains. This is a very dangerous product that is mainly composed of sodium hydroxide, commonly known as lye. Lye decomposes organic matter, hair, and grease, and tissue included. As the men continued this gruesome act, they tried taping the mouths of the victims shut to force them to ingest the Drano, but their mouths were wet and the tape would not stick. One of the men unscrewed the only light bulb in the basement, as it was well past 9 o'clock now, and he was worried that any lights still on the store would draw attention. So now all 5 victims lay in the dark with only the soft gray light of a parking lot fixture coming through a small basement window. Courtney lost track of where in the room the men were, but he could hear them whispering and arguing. Andrews went upstairs, and Courtney heard him unbolt the back door, walk through the gravel behind the store, and start up the car. Meanwhile, Pierre was rummaging around in the boxes in the basement. Courtney then heard the car back up towards the building. Andrews turned the car off and rapped on the back door to be let back into the store. Courtney could hear his mother wheezing and choking and coughing, and he could hear the other victims moaning. Andrews and Pierre then began making trips up and down the stairs, carrying boxes full of records to their car. He could hear them loading the car with merchandise over and over. When they were finished, Courtney heard the sounds of tissue paper, rustling, and wiping noises, and he realized the men were wiping the shelves down of any fingerprints they may have left. Pierre then felt his way through the dark room and screwed the light bulb back into the single socket. The light filled the center of the room, and now Courtney could see that the men were walking about, making sure they had taken everything they wanted. Then he heard something else. It was a thin, snapping noise, and he realized the men were putting on rubber gloves. Pierre walked over to Orrin Walker, Stanley's father, and bent down beside him. He removed Orrin's watch and put it in his pocket. He then reached into Orrin's pocket and pulled out his wallet. Andrews said, "How much is in there?" And Pierre said, $5, and ripped the bill from the wallet. Andrews said, "No, take the whole thing," and Pierre shoved the wallet into his pants pockets as well. Pierre then came to Courtney. He took his wallet from his back pocket and did the same to Stanley. He then took both Carol and Michelle's purses, but he left Carol's gold Rolex watch, her wedding ring, and another very ornate ring she was wearing where they were. He also left Michelle's diamond engagement ring on her hand. So I find that a little bit strange. Of all the things that are easiest to get rid of, credit cards are at the bottom of that list and jewelry's at the top of that list. The two men stood at the base of the stairs arguing. Their voices got louder and louder, and then Courtney heard Andrews say, "I can't do it, man. I'm scared." Pierre snapped back at Andrews. He said something Courtney couldn't quite make out, and then he said, "Give me about 30 minutes. Andrews ran up the stairs and left the store. The 5 victims were now left alone with Pierre. Pierre walked over to Carol Nesbitt and shot her in the head. Then he went to Stanley and shot him. He then came to Courtney, and Courtney winced as he heard the gun go off. He too had been shot. Pierre stood over Orrin Walker and fired into his head as well. He then grabbed Sherry Ansley and dragged her into the corner of the store. There he raped her and then shot her in the head. I often get comments from people who get after me for covering executions and talking about these types of criminals in a manner that I guess they feel is harsh. And, I get it. Some people like to be compassionate. And yes, I have empathy for everyone. I try to. I often talk about some of the horrific upbringings that killers have had and the fact that many of them are abused themselves. But as I've said before, if you ask me where my sympathy lies, it will always be with the innocent victim of a crime, regardless of what the perpetrator themselves has endured. This is a perfect example of why it's hard for me to dig up a scrap of empathy sometimes. These men, this is just absolutely disgusting, uncalled for murder of innocent people for records and some electronics equipment. I don't really care what killers have endured if they're going to commit acts like this. We all have choices. You are not a prisoner to your bad upbringing or to your abusive past. Does it affect you? Absolutely. Does it force you to become a monster yourself? Absolutely not. For me, it doesn't take much more than a case like this one to remind myself there's a reason that I feel the way I do. Look at this situation. It's just totally and completely abhorrent. These 2 kids working in a record store, a friend stops by, their parents come looking for them, and this is what they get? So yeah, I'm always happy to get your feedback, but please don't hold your breath if you're waiting for me to feel sorry for these perpetrators, because it won't happen. Sherry, Stanley, and Carol are all dead. Miraculously, Courtney and Orrin are not. At the risk of getting in trouble here on this platform, I can't tell the story without telling this next detail. This is the news. This detail was reported on the news, so I don't know, this platform is so arbitrary and I'm very frustrated with where I'm at right now, but I'm going to go ahead with the story. Pierre sees that Orrin is still moving. I couldn't find a lot of detail on whether or not he saw that Courtney was alive or why he did what he did next, but I'm assuming it's because he was out of bullets. Seeing that Orrin Walker is still alive, lying on his side on the carpet, Pierre grabs a ballpoint pen, sticks it into Orrin Walker's ear, and stomps on it. Thinking now that all of the victims are dead, Pierre bolts up the stairs and out into the parking lot. He gets in the getaway car with Andrews, and the driver, Keith Roberts, and the men drive away. Fortunately, Pierre was mistaken. Orrin Walker and Courtney Nesbitt were still alive. They lay there suffering in the basement for 3 hours. Back at the Walker residence, Stanley's mother, Orrin's wife, was beside herself. She woke her son, and the 2 of them got into their car and went looking for Stanley and Orrin. They found Stanley and Orrin's cars in the parking lot, and as they walked around the building, Orrin began making noise inside. He probably figured, I can hear someone walking around outside, we gotta let him know we're in here. Orrin's son broke down the back door at the hi-fi shop, and he and his mother found the horrific scene. Orrin's wife called the police while Orrin's son untied his father. Later that evening, a dispatcher at the Ogden Police Department answers the incoming call. She could hear the man on the other end saying people had been shot, people were dead, send police to the hi-fi shop on Washington Boulevard. Ogden police arrive at the shop with Officer George Throckmorton, a forensic crime scene specialist for the department. Throckmorton recalls, "When I got there, there was a man with a pen stuck in his ear running around. We found out the grisly details. The first thing we noticed was there were 4 people down there who had been tied up. Their feet had also been tied up, with the exception of the one girl who had been and killed." As Throckmorton continued to investigate the scene, it was clear what had happened. He later said in an interview, "They were given Drano, but the assailants in the basement found out it didn't kill them because they got sick and threw it up. So they gave them Drano again and put tape over their mouth so they couldn't throw up. And when that didn't work, they went around and started shooting them." As investigators searched the scene, they realized that Carol Nesbitt still had a faint heartbeat, but didn't feel there was any possible way she was going to regain consciousness. Still, she was rushed to the hospital, but she was then declared dead. Police were shocked at the level of brutality and violence. Now, Ogden is by far the roughest city in Utah, but it's still Utah. We don't get a lot of crimes of this nature here. Our crime rate is relatively low compared with other states in the U.S. Our murder rate is significantly lower than other places. Courtney Nesbitt and Orrin Walker were taken to the hospital to begin extensive treatment for their injuries. April 23, 1974. The manhunt was on. The entire next day was spent canvassing the area, looking for any clues on who committed these murders. 2 days after the murders, a tip from Hill Air Force Base brought police to the Air Force Station. The caller said William Andrews had confided in him months earlier, telling him, "One of these days, I'm going to rob that hi-fi shop, and if anybody gets in the way, I'm going to kill him." The tipster also told authorities to look in a dumpster that was on the Air Force Base. As they did that, they began to find personal items that had belonged to the victims. Carol and Sherry's purses were there, along with some of the victims' driver's licenses. One of the detectives, who later on received an award for his actions during this case, he began holding up each piece of discovered evidence to the crowd that had gathered around the dumpster watching what the police were doing. He began to watch the crowd, and it didn't disperse. All of the men on the Air Force Base from the nearby barracks stayed to watch the investigation, all but two. William Andrews and Dale Pierre had quickly walked off and were whispering. Other officers were now searching the barracks. As they searched, George Throckmorton realized something. An airman that he was already investigating for another murder involving an auto theft ring was living in the barracks right next to this dumpster. That airman, Pierre Dale Selby. So now we have one officer who has noticed that only two men walked away from the crowd and were seen standing, whispering off by the barracks, and another officer who realizes he's been to this particular barracks before on the murder case involving the auto theft ring. Luckily, the two officers got together and talked. You guys know how this goes. Sometimes police don't share information, but luckily these two did. The officers now have a pretty good idea of who they're looking at, and they immediately applied for a search warrant for Pierre and Andrew's entire barracks. When the warrant came through, the investigating officers and George Throckmorton, the forensics guy, began a search of the barracks, and George found something damning. He lifted a rug under Pierre's bed, and there, between the carpet and the padding, was a folded piece of paper. He opened it up and saw that it was a lease agreement for a storage unit that was about a block away from the hi-fi shop. The renter that was listed on the lease agreement? Pierre. George Throckmorton turned to look at Pierre, who was in the corner of the barracks, talking nonstop to one of the officers. Seems like he was one of those guys that thought he could talk his way out of anything. We see that a lot. Throckmorton walked over to Pierre and held out the lease agreement. He later said, "I showed him the lease agreement, and Pierre looked at it and shut his mouth and never spoke another word. I thought, bingo, we've got him." Police then went to the storage unit listed on the lease agreement. It was filled with all of the stolen hi-fi equipment from the store. Pierre was arrested and charged with multiple counts of aggravated murder and attempted murder. Authorities quickly linked William Andrews to the crime, and he was arrested as well. Soon, one of the men gave up the getaway driver, Keith Roberts, who began talking. In exchange for information, he received a promise to be charged with aggravated robbery and not with murder. October 15, 1974. The joint trial of Pierre and Andrews begins in Farmington, Utah. The murders and the trial were big news, not only in Utah, but nationwide. Cops around the country felt this case had been handled very well, swiftly, and with great expertise, and the media began holding this investigation up as an example of a good investigation. Orrin Walker, the survivor, testified. He called Pierre a sadist and said he was prancing around, very much enjoying what he was doing. Oren then said, after he shot Mrs. Nesbit first, then he was kind of prancing or walking in a manner that I got the impression he was kind of enjoying what he had been doing. Oren said, this has been hard for me. It's hard for me to believe that I was ever involved with this. My son, Stanley's life was taken with 2 shots and Drano. Pierre tried 5 different times to kill me. Each one could have been lethal. It certainly has changed our lives. Oren testified that his living son was traumatized by his brother's murder. Remember, the other son found this horrific scene. Oren said his son began sleeping on a mattress in his parents' bedroom and refused to ever go into the home's basement. Oren testified that most of his wife's time was spent in bed trying to forget the murder of her son. I talk about these cases all the time. Sometimes I just get like a flash of what it would be like. I just kind of got a flash of what it must have been to be tied up face down on the shag carpeting in some cold basement, knowing what's coming. You know, it must have been really bad. Another witness testified that Pierre and Andrews had watched the Clint Eastwood film Magnum Force over and over, where someone is forced to drink Drano and it immediately kills them in the film. That's where they got the idea for what they did, and they were surprised when the Drano didn't work like it did in the movies. So as is often the case, we've got 2 dangerous idiots, people that believe things they see in the movies. Courtney Nesbit did not testify at the trial because he had a severe brain injury and he had amnesia. He never really fully recovered from this event. November 16th, 1974. After deliberating, the jury returned guilty verdicts for both Pierre and Andrews. 4 days later, the judge sentenced them both to death. Keith Roberts, the getaway driver, was sentenced to 5 years to life, and he was released in 1987. He really got off easy. Nowadays, if you're the getaway driver, you get charged with murder. You are an accessory and you are charged just as if you pulled the trigger. So he's a lucky guy. Both Pierre and Andrews were sent off to death row and the usual appeals process began. At a clemency hearing, Pierre, who many believed was a psychopath, testified on his own behalf. He said, "The crime took a course of its own. It wasn't planned that way. People just kept coming in and I just panicked. The only way to prevent what happened was to have been moved away from the Air Force entirely. Of course, the alcohol and the pills I was consuming didn't help. Valiums, Reds, Black Beauties, and Yellow Jackets. Everyone has a limit beyond which they won't go. Drugs, etc. can alter that limit. I tell myself, you have to accept responsibility for it. You did it. You were there. You can't rationalize it." Well, I agree with that. But it really sounds like Pierre's blaming the drugs, the alcohol, blaming the Air Force. I had to get away from the Air Force for some reason. He's not taking responsibility. Andrews then testified at this same hearing that he had never even seen Pierre drink or do drugs. Pierre also changed his name 27 times in prison. He said it was to protect his family, and that is why there are so many versions of his name online. He can change his name 1,000 times, but there was no getting out of the punishment the jury had handed him. Pierre seems like one of those people that thinks they're smarter than everyone else in the room, but he couldn't talk his way out of what he did. August 28, 1987. Dale Selby Pierre is taken to the death chamber and executed by lethal injection. He bequeathed all of his property, a total of $29, to William Andrews. He was 34 years old at the time of his death. William Andrews' attorneys tried to make a case for clemency, stating Andrews was young. He was on drugs when he committed the crime. You chose to take the drugs. That's not an excuse. They also said he was a changed man, but that didn't really fly, as Andrews had a lengthy record of prison violations, including arson and making weapons. He had continued to be a problem and to be dangerous even in prison.
In an exclusive interview, Andrews told Jennifer Skiff how he met Selby in the Air Force and his impressions of the man.
That's the strange thing about Selby. He didn't like to go out very much. He was basically a loner.
Selby told the Utah Board of Pardons that he was drunk or on drugs much of the time before the murder. Andrews contradicts that story.
If he drank, I never saw him drunk.
Andrews and Selby planned to rob the hi-fi shop together as they were getting out of the Air Force and leaving the state.
Take the money and run.
Andrews says he knew and liked victim Stanley Walker, a clerk at the hi-fi shop.
The only one I knew, like I said, was Stanley, and I did like him.
He said he joked with Walker during the robbery.
I remember joking with Stanley about how good a sale he had done with me on the equipment, how he had created a desire in me to have this equipment.
Friendly feelings didn't help. Andrews and Selby forced Walker and the other victims to drink Drano.
I held the gun, and he gave me the Drano. He held the cup. I poured it into the cup, and he handed it to the people.
Andrews says he didn't intend for the Drano to kill anyone.
I was never under the impression that the Drano would actually kill anyone.
Prosecutors say Andrews is lying. The Drano was intended to kill, and Andrews gives himself away with statements such as this.
I was informed that the Drano hadn't worked. It apparently hadn't accomplished the aims that he wanted to achieve.
Andrews told Selby he would not kill and left.
I said, I can't kill these people. I don't believe you can kill these people. So let's just leave. Let's get out of here. And I left. But when I left the hi-fi shop at that time, no one was dead. No, everyone was still alive.
In July of 1992, William Andrews was executed by lethal injection, and I will be covering his execution on my playlist, Dining with the Damned. He was 37 years old at the time of his death and had spent 18 years on death row. In 1982, author Gary Kinder wrote a book about the hi-fi murders using the memories of Courtney Nesbitt for reference. The book is called Victim: The Other Side of Murder. Kinder formed the opinion that Andrews and Roberts were terrified of Pierre and that Pierre was a vicious psychopath. A film starring Richard Chamberlain was made about this event in 1991. The film is called Aftermath: A Test of Love. You can watch the whole film here on YouTube. I will include a link to the film in the description of this episode.
What the hell is going on? Ross, where's my wife? Ross, she's supposed to be here. Where is she?
Well, we're trying to phone her, Ross. There's no answer.
There's no answer. Of course there's no answer. She's out looking for him. What the hell is going on?
All I know is your son was shot in the head.
Shot in the head?
And he drank some sort of acid, caustic.
Acid?
We've established an airway, but he's in severe pulmonary edema. I called Bill Saints. He should be here any second to help with his chest and lungs. Frenzel's on his way back.
Is he gonna live?
Frenzel thought he'd be dead in an hour. We kept him alive for nearly 2.
Where the hell is his mother? If he ever needed her, it's now. Where the hell is she?
I don't know, Ross.
So what happened to the survivors? Courtney Nesbitt returned to high school a year after the murders and graduated with his class in 1976. He tried to attend college, but the brain damage he suffered proved to be too much for him and he was forced to drop out. He had a hard time holding down a job as well, and he was soon on disability. He married Catherine Hunter in 1985, but Courtney suffered with chronic pain his whole life and had memory issues as well. He died on June 4th, 2002 at only 44 years of age. Courtney's father, Dr. Byron Nesbitt, had lost his wife and his son. He spent his life delivering thousands of babies in Ogden, and he retired around 2010. He told the media, "My life is going to go on. Nobody's going to change that but me. Nobody." Orrin Walker, who lost his son that awful night and testified against the men who committed these evil acts against him, against his son, died in 2000 at 69 years of age. The ripple effects of this crime continue on as family and friends of the victims suffer the effects of this terrible act. It is a terrifying example of just how easily and quickly an average day can change the lives of so many people forever if they are unfortunate enough to cross paths with monsters like Pierre and William Andrews. Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death, True Crime Tuesday. Hit the like button if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel if you would like to see more from me. It does help me a lot. Stay safe and be kind to each other, and I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.